Hi guys, so continuing our discussion on latency, and now Andy and I are still in the same place, but Anders is in somewhere slightly different. We can't get away from it.
Yeah. Hello from Qatar.
What are you doing in Qatar?
I'm sitting in hotel quarantine for 2 days, and then I'll do some Pro Tools courses here for Avid. So it's good fun.
Awesome. Who are you training? Because this is cool.
The sound engineers at Al Jazeera TV network.
Yeah.
So I'm really looking forward to that.
And
nice.
Who said that Avid training never gets you anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big takeaway here. I thought about that yesterday when I was sitting at the plane. It's like the best decision of my life was to get Avid certified. It got me to all parts of the world, and it's been, I mean, it's opened up so many doors. And I'm always telling stories about my clients, what they have achieved, like people getting jobs just because they went and did their operator and stuff. And I tend to forget myself that it's really opened every door for me. So it's been the best investment in my life ever.
Yeah, because without that, you wouldn't be in Qatar and you wouldn't be with us on Pro Tools Answers.
That's
true. Right, so continuing our conversation then into latency. Where would you like to start, Andy?
Well, I think, just to kind of go back to the crux of what we talked about in the first part of this, there's a difference between the latency that we contend with when we're recording, and that can be the interface and so on and so forth, and it can also be plugins, and then the latency that we contend with when we're mixing, which is really only plugins. We don't really usually worry too much about input and output latency unless we're using hardware buffers, but that's or hardware inserts, but that's kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. And I think, Anders, you wanted to show a little bit, because we were talking about the HD native system, about how low latency works in an HD native system.
Yeah, so the HD native system has this fantastic little chip on it called the FPGA, which is the Field Programmable Gate Array, which is the exact same chip as sits on the HDX, with the only real difference is you get the same low latency recording, but you can't use plugins while recording. But it gives you a very low latency path. And I don't have an HD native system, but so Dave, can you please show your screen?
Yeah,
sure. So for those of you who have the HD native system, what you can do is set up one path that has extreme low latency. So you basically don't have any latency or very, very minimum latency in your headphones while recording. So if you go to Setup I/O, and in the output path, tab, there is the low latency monitoring down in the right corner. So you have to manually enable this. And this low latency monitoring output path needs to be something other than your monitoring path. So usually you would set that up to be the headphone amplifier for the musicians, or basically the cue mix for the musicians. So you'd set that up to be your headphones out, like Dave is showing here, and you need to hit OK here. And Andy, I'm not sure if this is still in there, but do you need to go into options and enable low latency monitoring as well, or have they removed
God, what
that?
a good question.
Let's check it out.
I'm going to say yes, but I could be wrong. Go ahead and check me on that. I think it's still in there.
Yeah, it's in there.
Yeah, there it is at the bottom.
So that also needs to be checked. So in that case, now you have this extreme low latency monitoring path through the HD native system.
Right, and I think it's worth noting, and again, not to bang the drum on Carbon or HDX, but one of the things that with a native system that you have to choose is which stereo path will get that preferred performance. So if you've got one one stereo path going out to all your musicians, you're fine. But if you wanted to send, different cue mixes using sends or whatever, how we do it a lot of different ways, then at that point you can choose one that's going to have low latency, but everybody else is going to get slightly different timing, which is not a problem if you have a Carbon or an HDX system.
Yeah, totally. And I think there was also like a price difference here to consider, of course. But in terms of having a native recording system, this is as low latency as you can possibly get without going into HDX or Carbon.
So you guys, all of us have Omnis, right?
Yes.
Yes.
So, and I've got my Omni here. I'll be honest, and I'm a persnickety person when it comes to latency, and of course, me being just here in my own room by myself, I've got my one monitoring path, and just turning that on to low latency, zero complaints. I mean, it's not a problem at all, and I'm listening for problems, and it's completely fine. But it's completely fine for me if I had a friend that came into the studio, or a friend just in general, then one of us would get low latency and the other person would not get quite as good a performance, right?
So
fortunately, I don't have any friends.
I just wanted to you have two here, which is not in the same country as you to record. we get epic latency if we were doing recording sessions together regularly. Are we just to clarify, we're talking about we get latency when we're recording through plugins. Right, if there were no plugins on the system, latency there's nothing to talk about, because the signal would go in and it would come back, right? According to the hardware buffer, because we're in HD native land, right? But we're talking
and that's
go
ahead.
We're talking about the compensation that would take place with some heavy plugins.
So that's such a good question. First of all, turning on low latency monitoring will improve performance even if there are no plugins on the track. Right. So, so if you've got an empty track, no plugins on there, you'll hear a distinct difference between the track that you have low latency monitoring configured for and tracks that you don't. Right. Again, none of this is a problem with HDX, but in the context of this question, the second thing is, and Anders, I think you would agree with me, is that there's no free lunch when it comes to recording through plugins. Plugins take time to process math, and there's very little way to get around it.
Well, the two ways that we have access to are HDX cards and the Avid Carbon, right? Which give you DSP processing on the card that is so incredibly fast and optimized, so that you will have zero latency while monitoring that signal. Or
through plugins.
Yeah, through plugins.
Yeah. And can I just share my screen and I'll show what I'm talking about? Because I think this is where a lot of people get in a tiz, is that they're trying to record in the middle of a mix, add stuff in the middle of a mix, and they're wondering why they get plugin latency, and they're blaming the app or the interface for the latency that they're experiencing, because they expect to have zero latency, right? Because what they've been marketed to. Hold on, let me hit my share button, because I'm getting good at this. So what I'm talking about is people are expecting to be able to record through plugins, and they're expecting to have no latency appear. So if we record onto this vocal track right here, and I'll stick EQ3 on, this is a no-cost plugin. It's not introducing any delay whatsoever, so they're not going to experience any problems, right? But the moment that we start using things that are a bit more processor intensive, like PSP's standard plugin, that introduces 12,000 samples of delay. So recording through that one,
highly recommended.
Yeah. So
let's do that.
Is the engine designed to mitigate that?
Yes, it's also mitigating it, but you will have that delay actually in your ears, and it's probably like, don't record through that plugin, right?
Yeah, right. So what will happen is the engine, if we were recording through this plugin, which is going to be incredibly uncomfortable anyway, because you're not going to be able to do it. It's going to be too much delay there.
Right.
If you were able to get through an entire take, the take would finish, and then Pro Tools would then compensate for that delay by moving the clip into its correct position. Right.
That's right.
That's what it's designed to do. But in terms of monitoring, forget about it.
Unless you are tremendously disciplined mentally and can.
And again, this is coming back to, I think, a lot of people. The crux of a lot of people's issues is that they're trying to record through plugins like that without really taking into any account that the plugin that they might be using is introducing such an amount of delay, because it requires a significant amount of processing to do what the plugin needs to do. Right. And they're going, hold on, isn't Pro Tools supposed to compensate all this for me? And they're getting all in the tiz about it.
Let's just differentiate between two different things here as well. And in your session, can you show your screen again, Dave? So the automatic delay compensation engine, as you say, will compensate for plugins or delay caused by plugins. And as you also said, after you record something, so when you're recording, you're listening to the delayed signal. So let's say you have processing for 10,000 samples of delay on your track. And when you're recording, you're listening to stuff being played 10,000 samples late. And Pro Tools knows that. And as soon as you finish recording, it will shift the material that you heard 10,000 samples too late back 10,000 samples, so that it will align with where you heard it. Okay, so that's not the same thing as what you're talking about, which is your monitoring delay when you're actually listening to it. So you will sing to some material that is 10,000 samples late, and that's when you sing, that will get switched back. But you're actually monitoring situation in this case where you induced 12,000 samples more delay. That is just your monitoring delay and will not get shifted back.
Yeah,
that's right.
I hope I explained that.
Well, you're listening.
So the solution here would be: is there a DSP version of this effect that you can use on an HDX or on that would work? In other cases, you will always have that monitoring delay through that. Plugin.
I don't know if they have a DSP version of the plugin. I think it's a native only company, but that's not necessarily the only problem. You know, we could still mitigate all of the plugins from that track or get rid of all the plugins from that track. Sorry, and have no delay being introduced by plugins on that track. But if we have stuff around it that is also going to be causing some delay, where Pro Tools is trying to keep everything together, suddenly we have that track also being delayed, right?
But see that's not a problem, because as Anders was saying, so for example, in this particular case, in your case right there, this session, when you hit the space bar, will play back 4,427 samples late. Which means you're going to hear it in your headphones, 4,000 some odd samples late.
Okay.
And even if there's no plugin on that track, you're going to sing to it 4,000 samples late. But Pro Tools knows it. And so what will happen is when your record pass is done, it shifts it earlier by 4,400 and whatever samples.
Awesome. So we're getting to the crux of the solution. If we're recording amidst a mix and plugins around it are introducing 4,000 odd samples of delay, you're hearing that delay and you're singing at it, and Pro Tools shifts it after you hit stop to stop the record pass, but it will only work if there are no plugins on the actual channel.
Well, the plugins on the actual channel is what's going to affect how you perceive what you've just sung.
How you're perceiving what you're performing.
Yeah.
Well, you could still use plugins that introduce as little delay as possible, because that delay will actually cause you to hear the processed signal late, right?
Yep, okay.
So in this case, you're not adding one sample of delay by adding this. So in this case, you will still hear everything playing back. Of course, this has to do with the same things that we talked about last time, which is the hardware buffer size. So if your session can play this session back, or your computer can play this session back at a low hardware buffer size, you still only have very minimum amount of delay.
That's right.
Yeah, right. So
Latency.
So
latency.
So if you're wanting to record monitoring through an EQ and monitoring through some kind of compression, you've got to choose a plugin that isn't going to introduce any cost. So if we were recording through
on a native system, yes.
Yeah, right. So if we were recording through, I think it's going to be hard actually to find anything other than PSP Neon that isn't going to provide us a plugin cost.
I don't know. Do you have any Universal Audio plugins?
Oh, well, let's talk about Universal Audio, shall we? Nice segue.
Well, so there are some plugins that just have a ton of latency because they're meant to be used in a certain way, and I know people over at Universal Audio. I have a Universal Audio interface right here in the studio that I'm quite fond of, but there's no denying that there are some plugins out there on the market, many of them UA plugins, that have just a massive amount of latency because they're meant to be used on mixed buses. They're not meant to be tracked through at all. And you just have to be very careful. You have to be mindful of the plugins that you're using if you're working with a native system.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying here as well, Andy, is that I've had so many support cases, clients having phoned me up and have had problems with their setups where they basically are using Universal Audio and an HDX card and native plugins and going in through the different parts here. And you have to consider what's actually happening when you're busing stuff from the CPU out to the HDX card, back into the native processing realm, out to through the USB bus into the Universal Audio, and then back again and out to the HDX and vice versa. And just doing a couple of these hops back and forth will break your system. Basically, the system will not be able to compensate for that amount of busing things back and forth.
And long before that, it's going to be unbearable from a recording perspective. Yeah. So I remember I was teaching VTV, which is in Hanoi, Vietnam Television, which is the national broadcaster over there in Vietnam. And I got this question from one of the students, really smart guy, newest stuff, and he goes, "I'm tracking through or mixing through. I can't remember which one he said. One of the UA plugins, and he showed me, and it had a ridiculous amount of latency, just massive, and I looked at it, I'm like, this must be a bug. This can't possibly be. And so I called a person that I know at Universal Audio, because a lot of the folks that worked at Avid work at Universal Audio now, and in fact, this guy that I talked to used to work at Avid, went to Universal Audio, and now he's back at Avid. That's how much of a revolving door this industry has sometimes. And I said, so do you know this plugin? He goes, oh yeah, I know it. And I'm like, it can't possibly, does it really have this much latency? He goes, oh yeah, it does. I'm like, wow. How can that possibly be? He goes, you should only use that on the mix bus, and you should never use it when recording. I'm like, well, do you mention that anywhere? He goes, nope. I'm like, and so you have to know kind of how your bodies are buried, and know where your latency latency is being incurred, so that you can work with it. Because this was one that if you put this on a subgroup, this particular plugin, which I don't even remember what it was, but it was just a monster. If you put this on a subgroup, that subgroup is now out of sync with everything else in your session. So the only thing you could do is either make sure you put it on all of your subgroups, or not put it on any of your subgroups and just put it on your main bus. Now, if you put it on the main bus, does that mean your entire mix is latent? Yes, it does. But your entire mix going through that would then still remain in phase. So it doesn't.
It just means that you hear it a little later. That's all. Let me show you this, because I just showed you PSP's just the standard version of the plugin.
Sure. Cool.
Let me show you probably something similar to what, Andy, you've been talking about. Their high resolution version. Hello.
Yeah. So immediately it breaks the automatic delay compensation engine. Mm-hmm. So, and now if you go into the into the edit window, you'll see the delay indicator right there in the main counter has now turned red, which basically tells you you've broken the limits of the delay compensation engine right up there at the top.
Oh, of course. Sorry.
Yeah, that guy right there. So whenever you see that turn red, stop what you're doing, because something is happening and you need to be aware of it. Now, if you take a look at that particular plugin, if you put that on your main output, zero problem. Then your entire mix is going through there, and that's what that's designed to do. But if you put it on just a vocal track, that vocal track is now. Yeah. You're going to have to nudge the clip if you want it to actually be in sync with your session, and nobody wants to go back to those days.
Yeah, it doesn't mean it won't play. It will just mean that you're going to hear the entire mix, everything that's bussed through this bus. It'll just be later than you're expecting it. Which
that's right.
It's not much, but it's still
beyond the compensation limit. Yeah,
it's not going to break anything.
Yeah, just to be clear, I mean, you guys out there, you're receiving the premium content here. So if you own a universal audio card and maybe an HDX or maybe not, what's the best strategy to use those types of effects? Well, obviously going back and forth between the different processing realms, native, HDX, and universal audio is a bad idea. Mm-hmm. So do all of the HDX plugins in one go, and do all of the universal audio in one go, and all of the native processing in one go as much as possible. And actually in this order: native processing first,
right?
Then you do the universal audio processing, and then you do the HDX processing. Now, this is to maximize the performance of each of those processes. Of course, you might want to break a rule here and there, but that will give you optimal performance and the most power out of each of those alternatives.
Well said, 100% right.
Do you think there might be a sect of people out there that would say, well, I own these plugins, I own this program, I want to run them in the way that I want to run them?
Yeah, do it. But I mean,
you can, but
there's a cost.
But there's a cost for that. You will eventually run out of resources, and much faster by doing so.
Well,
I mean,
when a guy from the manufacturer says, "Don't do it," think before you do. Now, but it does. There is a lot that can be compensated for, right? So if you've got, and now I think we're moving from the discussion on recording latency into the realm of mixing latency. Mm-hmm. So let's kind of draw a line, right? And we've talked about, hearing back in your cans, recording latency. Let's talk about keeping your mix coherent while you're mixing, which is kind of related to what we've talked about already, but the good news is until it becomes a problem, it's completely not.
Yeah. So one thing that people tend to forget when buying an interface is how Pro Tools knows the interface. So if you're buying an Avid interface, that could be an MBox, an old MBox, or when we're talking about HD native interfaces like the Omni or an HDI or anything else. If you buy an Avid interface, Pro Tools will know about the round-trip latency incurred by this interface. So when you're connecting like a hardware processor, like a compressor, an EQ, or something like that, and send that through an hardware insert, Pro Tools will automatically compensate for all of the latency, unless the processor you're using is a digital one, which causes delay. So if you're using a digital reverb or something, that will cause its own delay, which Pro Tools obviously can't know about. So you have to manually measure that delay and insert that delay. And I think this is one of the most overlooked factors when buying an interface, that the Avid interfaces will just do it for you.
Yeah, the human has got to be in there somewhere, especially the more things that you add outside of the Avid ecosystem.
Yeah, of course.
So let's finish off this episode then with bullet pointing everything that we've talked about so far. So Andy.
Yes. First bullet point, the difference between recording latency is what you hear in your headphones, and mixing latency, which is the latency caused by your plugin during the mixing phase. They're related, but in terms of workflow, different things.
Cool.
And bullet point number 2, keep your hardware buffer size as low as possible to minimize the recording latency that you hear in your headphones while recording.
Mm-hmm. And if you're still experiencing latency with the buffer as low as you can go, and you're still getting hardware buffer errors, for example, disable some plugins with Command Control Click, and then continue to lower the buffer as far as you can go.
Now, the entire discussion that we had before was primarily focused on a native system. A lot of these problems go away if you have an HDX card or a Carbon, which has specific DSP chips on board that do that processing much, much faster. So you can have plugins, record through plugins. Latency is generally not an issue on those systems, although they do cost more.
Final bullet point is for you, I think, Dave.
There is one more. There's 2 more, in fact. So when you are mixing, make sure the ADC is on, and that the delay compensator isn't red. I meant if you're using universal audio stuff or all plugins that introduce a significant amount of delay, just keep an eye on the latency delay compensation display on the mix window, just so you know how much delay is being introduced, and make a decision as to what to do with those. Which is more than likely going to be turn them off, or move them,
or move them to a place where they're intended to be used.
Yeah. Okay. We can wrap that one up then now.
Woohoo!
Awesome stuff. So
an episode that spanned 2 continents.
Yeah.
Indeed.
3 or no 2.
I think all of them kind of do, don't they?
Well, yeah, okay. We spanned one more continent than we normally do.
We've just added another continent.
We added another continent.
Okay. Hopefully that was useful to all of you guys. Thank you very much, and let us know what you thought. We will see you in the next one. Take it easy.
Thanks, guys.